It is an absolute pleasure to be back here in Copenhagen. I love coming to the city and visiting Denmark. Fortunes are going to be made. But the biggest risk that we face today as businesses and as countries is to identify the risks that we do not see on a day-to-day basis. This is going to require that we step outside of our bodies and think about not just geopolitical, but also economic risks that are bubbling around the world. The critical issue is that we do not focus on those risks, but someday we'll hit ourselves on the forehead and say, how could we not have seen them? These are the words of the outgoing CEO and chairman of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein. He made these comments just before the financial crisis of 2008. In this context, my responsibility here is very simple and straightforward. I am here to suggest to you an array of issues that I fear we're not focusing enough on, and yet they threaten to upend the global economy and create significant challenge, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world. I do not have slides this afternoon, so what I'm going to do for a moment is just present to you the broad outline or roadmap of my discussion this afternoon. First, I'm going to focus on the tactical short-term issues that are at our doorstep today. I will focus on the economics, geopolitical, and what I call other trends that are impacting the global economy and our geopolitical environment. Next, I'm going to focus the majority of my discussion today on the structural factors, of which there are 6, that I fear are really at the core of risk for the global economy and for society as we know it. I suspect that that will take me to my 20-minute mark, so I won't be able to give you solutions, but hopefully during Q&A, we can talk more about how we might avert the challenges and the clear calamity that we are threatened by today. So let's start with the tactical picture. In terms of economics, there is a rising discussion, a rising din, that we will be facing a global recession by 2020. According to Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, eminent economists like Nouriel Roubini, and many other business leaders, there is now caution and concern that this post or aftermath of financial crisis era in which we've seen significant economic growth and really incredible stock market performance will soon come to an end. If you look around the world, I just flew in from Argentina today, places like Argentina, Turkey, South Africa are not only dealing with financial crises already, but are already in recession in many cases. So this underpinning concern around the global economy is becoming much more real. We're seeing inflationary pressures and real concerns around debt in places like Britain. Across Europe, there remain concerns about unemployment, even though we have seen significant improvements in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Countries like China, that were important players in terms of averting a real calamity in the last financial crisis, are themselves struggling, with the Chinese stock markets falling about 20% this year. The economic picture is just one piece of the puzzle. There are also significant concerns around the geopolitical environment. One thing worth remembering is that liberal democracies have only survived in the world for approximately 1% of the totality of human time. 1%. And less than 30% of the world's population has enjoyed liberal democracies. So perhaps it's not a surprise that voter participation rates have fallen so significantly, not just in the United States, but across Europe. It may not be a surprise that money has seeped into the political process and that over 50% of the money that was put into the American political election in 2016 was just from 158 families. The geopolitical dynamics has created much more skepticism around democracy. As Freedom House, an agency in Washington, D.C., has cited, in the past 10 years, every single year, we have recorded a decline in freedoms, including in developed nations. This geopolitical picture is challenging liberal democracy, but it's also emboldening countries that are totalitarian and that are also non-market capitalist. There are other trends that we should be worried about. The refugee status around the globe is deeply concerning. According to the International Rescue Committee, today there are 70 million people, more than at any other time in history, that are now displaced or out of their homes. This is a challenge that is expected to continue. And it's worth reminding you that my own home continent of Africa will represent 40% of the world's population by 2070. Without economic growth and significant improvement in people's livelihoods there, we may continue to see massive disorderly migration as we've seen in the last few years. Disease, in particular, communicable diseases are on the rise. According to CDC, the Center for Disease Control, diseases like Ebola, Zika, SARS, that have plagued the world's, particularly emerging markets, are increasing both in terms of prevalence and incidence. To make matters worse, Sally Davies, who is the head of the medical facilities in the United Kingdom, has argued that the drugs no longer work. The drugs that we have used to try and combat many diseases and to put them at bay are now actually not being as impactful as they have been in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, if I haven't managed to depress you enough so far, I'm now going to talk to you about the structural factors. Yes, there are even more problems that we have to deal with. There are 6 things that I'm going to outline for you that are deeply structural to the global economy. Many of them you will have heard of, but I would like to spend some time to highlight them so that they remain top of mind for you in the challenges that we face ahead. Let me first list them for you, and then I'll give you some color on each of them individually. Number 1, technology and the risk of the jobless underclass. We just heard about Alibaba, but the story is much beyond just Alibaba. It's about what the impact of technology will do for joblessness. Number 2, demographic shifts. Shifts in both the quality and the quantity of the global workforce, bound to have significant effects on how we live around the world. Number 3, income inequality. Something that was irrelevant when I was completing my PhD at Oxford many years ago. Today, it is in the top 3 agenda items for many of the global policymakers. Number 4, natural resource scarcity and concerns around the environment and climate change. I had the privilege a couple of years ago to join a group of 20 people who spent time with President Xi Jinping in China. At that meeting, we asked the president, what was the thing that kept him up at night and that worried the president of the largest population on the planet? His response was natural resource scarcity, and I'll highlight some of the thinking in a moment. Number 5, the sheer debt that the world is carrying today. Unprecedented in history of amount of debt, and really a concern, particularly in a rising interest rate environment. And finally, productivity. Productivity is a key engine, a key driver of economic growth, and yet productivity has declined in virtually every developed country over the last 10 years. Significant puzzle around productivity, which I'll highlight in a moment. Let me start with technology and the risk of the jobless underclass. According to McKinsey, the global consulting firm, they estimate that approximately 800 million people around the world are at risk of losing their jobs because of automation. A report from Oxford University that has since been challenged considerably argues that 47% of jobs in the United States, 47% of jobs would be gone by 2030 because of technology and automation. More specifically, there are 5 million jobs in the United States which are at risk because those 5 million jobs are for people who are in the delivery sector, either in delivering goods and services or in taxi cabs. Significant risk of upending the global economy because ultimately we know about machines replacing humans. It's worth pointing out for a moment that technology and public policy tends to focus on technology, specifically in the risk of the jobless underclass. But there are enormous other risks, such as AI, issues around blockchain, and Bitcoin in particular is one of the cryptocurrencies that everybody's been talking about. But other risks, such as quantum computing, which might put China at a distinct advantage in terms of supremacy in terms of technology. But let me remind you really quickly where the world has come in the last 100 years vis-a-vis technology and why this is a particular problem today. At the turn of the last century in 1900, 60% of Americans were involved in agriculture in some fashion. We know that today that number is less than 2% of Americans. People in the workforce in the United States moved out of agriculture into manufacturing and from manufacturing into the service sector. Today, roughly 80% of Americans are in the service sector, very similar to many developed European countries, and only 18% are involved in the manufacturing sector. This highlights the problem that we have as public policymakers and economists. What sector is big enough and broad enough to absorb hundreds of millions of people who are involved in a sector that is likely to be disrupted by technology? This is the question that is before us. Second, demographic shifts. I mentioned to you that the key question before us is around quality and quantity of the world's population, particularly the workforce. Let me start with quantity. Today, about 7.5 billion people on the planet, a little bit more by some estimates. The forecast by the United Nations is that the world's population will continue to grow at a clip until 2100, when there'll be 11 billion people in the world. These numbers might not mean anything as a standalone, but let me remind you that it took 125 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion people. And it's taken just 50 years to go from 3 billion to nearly 8 billion people. Countries like India are adding 1 million people a month to their population. The global world population is growing at about 60 million people a year, which is adding approximately a Germany, or actually maybe the UK is a better estimate. We simply are not prepared for this wall of humanity. And as I mentioned to you earlier, 90% of the world's population is living in the emerging markets, and increasingly that's where we expect the population growth to increase. In terms of the quality of the workforce, I encourage you to look at the OECD report, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Every 3 years, they put out a report called the PISA program, the Program of International Student Assessment. It is an assessment of students in reading, science, and mathematics around the world. Many of the leading developed countries were in the top 3 to 5 most highly ranked countries a few years ago. Today, many of those countries, the United States and many European countries that the world relies on for innovation and R&D to solve some of the biggest challenges that the world faces today, are now at the bottom ranks, sometimes number 27, 28, and even number 30. Simply not good enough if we're going to try and address these significant challenges that we face. Income inequality, number 3. An issue that I mentioned earlier was not even discussed when I was doing my doctorate. Today, having just had a meeting with President Macri in Argentina this last few days, he, as you may be aware, will be hosting the G20 in November. This is the key issue, not just for politicians at home, but globally. What are we going to do with the vast schism between the rich and the poor that has arisen around the world? Today, the wealthiest 8 men, they're all men, 8 men have more money than the bottom 50% of the world's population. It's not just about income, it's about what that type of inequality does for access to education and healthcare, but also for political representation. Real concerns, because the truth is, as economists and public policymakers, we don't know how to solve income inequality. We have tried left-leaning policies like redistribution and tax and spend, even universal basic income discussions, which have become very in vogue. Unfortunately, those have not stopped the stem of widening income inequality. We have also tried right-leaning interventions. Supply side, keep taxes low, rely on businesses to hire people and improve welfare and improve incomes. That has also not worked. The truth is we don't know what way we can actually do, what policies we can institute to try and address this. Perhaps the one that's most optimistic is about combating social mobility, which I might add has gone down by 50% in countries like the United States over the last 30 years. I'll just leave you with one last point regarding income inequality. Today, the largest economy in GDP terms in the world is the United States. This is a country with about $18 trillion of GDP. A country that is market capitalist based, and it has an ethos of democracy, liberal democracy as its political system. Second largest economy in the world, China, about 16 trillion GDP. Some estimates expect that China will surpass the United States in terms of largest economy. But for now, the second largest economy in the world has deprioritized democracy as its political stand, and it has state capitalism, where the government is the arbiter of capital and labor as its economic approach. These two countries, number one and number two largest economies in GDP terms in the world, have completely different political systems and completely different economic systems, and yet they have the same measure of Gini coefficient, which is the measure of income inequality, at around 0.45. To make matters worse, China's income inequality has improved over the last 10 years, and the income inequality of the United States has worsened. People ask me on my travels, and I've been very fortunate, I've traveled to over 80 countries around the world, and people ask me all the time, which model should we pick if we care about income inequality? This is a very difficult question because we don't know what the answer is. Natural resource scarcity. I mentioned to you that President Xi argued that this is the key issue for them. He's argued very clearly that we have promised people around the world that they can live like the average European and that they can live like the average American. And yet, there's increasingly pressures on potable water, arable land, energy, and minerals. The pressures, obviously, also from the climate change agenda, concerns about erosion in the environment, put additional concerns. And in a world where there's less and less global cooperation means that we're under immense pressure to solve this issue. Number 5 is debt. Every class of debt in the United States today, government debt, household debt, credit card debt, student loan debt, auto loan debt, is over $1 trillion, every single class. It is very clear, according to the CBO, Congressional Budget Office of the United States government, that this is of deep concern and that there's really no way out, albeit using a reserve currency to print money for the United States, particularly in a time where economic growth, although the numbers seem to be good, is of pretty low quality. How we get out of this problem, which is not just an American phenomenon, the issue of debt is a serious problem here in Europe, is still not clear to many public policymakers. And lastly, productivity. If you ask economists what drives economic growth, there are 3 factors. Capital, which is how much money you have. It could be land, tenure, or actual dollars in your account. Number 2 is labor, which we touched on, both the quality and the quantity of your workforce. And number 3 is this factor called productivity, which truly most people haven't really spent much time thinking about. And yet productivity explains the majority of why countries grow. It explains 60% of why one country grows and another one does not. And as I mentioned to you earlier, productivity has been on the decline for the last 10 years across much of the developed world. Think of productivity as the amount of output each of us contributes to GDP every year. Why is this a conundrum or a puzzle for policymakers? We don't understand why, at a time where we've seen such an increase in technology that should speed up our efforts, why we've seen a decline in productivity. And we can talk some more about some of the theories on why that's the case. I'm out of time, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this. My only 2 sentences to leave with you is we are in a world where ideology is the enemy of growth. We have to think about our businesses surviving a world where market capitalism and democracy may not be the dominant features of the places that we want to live and work. More importantly, there are real challenges around whether or not our businesses can survive in a world where the world is much more siloed and a global umbrella no longer suffices. I will end by telling you something that Mark Twain, the writer, said many years ago. It is not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that is just not so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dambisa Moyo. This really opens up a lot of fundamental issues. We'll see how much we can cover in these 10 minutes. But as you said, let's talk solutions. So simple question, how do we fix it? No, let's see. Let's take one thing at a time.
In 10 minutes.
Yeah,
that's plenty of time.
Well, you have some suggestions
yes.
to changes that could be implemented in our political systems. For instance, in most democracies, elections are held every 4 or 5 years, but you say that this creates a short-sightedness. Can you explain the schism you see here?
Yes.
And why we need to perhaps change that?
So one of the fundamental things that I think is pretty much accepted now is that we have way too much myopia in both political and business leadership. In business leadership, people talk about CEOs and the CFO tenures being short, holding periods in stock portfolios also being short, etc. In the political realm, we worry about the point that you just raised, that there are elections far too frequently. In the United States, there are elections every 2 years. And yet all the problems I've outlined to you, whether it's social mobility issues, concerns around infrastructure, or even education, these are long-term investments, and they require long-term pragmatic thinking, where public policymakers are not seduced by today's voters to putting in public policies that get them into office, but actually do not help in the long term. So what I'm proposing is some way to split or to bridge this schism between these long-term economic challenges and the short-termism that we see in public policy. And part of that, one way, is to extend terms in public policy. None of the proposals that I have in my recent book, Edge of Chaos, are crazy, out of my own mind. They are looking around the world and looking at how different countries are addressing some of these issues. And there are many countries that have longer terms that are better matched with business cycles, which are at least 5 years long.
Which brings us to the next question, which I'm taking from Pigeonhole here. Someone asks, how do we make it more desirable for governments and politicians, perhaps businesses, to think ahead 30, 50 years?
So I'll give you a crazy idea. I mean, it sounds crazy here, I'm sure, but one of the things I propose, which has been very successful in Singapore, is pay your politicians more. Pay them more, but force them to justify their compensation. In countries like Singapore, politicians earn 30 to 40% bonuses at the end of every year based on their performance of key metrics. Life expectancy increases, improvements in education by third-party measurements, etc. The beauty of that system is that if they find that the government is not performing, they will claw back salaries. Now, this might sound familiar because if you think about how we operate in the private sector, there are many more metrics tied to performance. Our compensations tend to be much more regimented. And I just think that that's something that Singapore, but other countries around the world have shown can work for public policymakers if we start to force them to think much more long-term and actually attach their compensation to longer-term outputs.
Do you think that myopia, that short-sightedness, also applies to businesses having to report every quarter, perhaps blurring the long-term strategies?
Absolutely. One of my favorite books is a book called Outsiders by William Thorndike. His very fundamental point, which I think is so clear when I sit in boardrooms now, I really raise it a lot, is that the companies that outperform on a long-term basis, and by that I mean outperform their peers and outperform benchmarks, are companies where the CEO has only one job, and the job is to focus on capital allocation. They don't do anything else. They're not distracted by the markets. They're not distracted by issues around compliance and legality. They have another position. So they give, this book, by the way, gives 8 case studies. A classic example of this would be Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger runs the day-to-day operations of Berkshire Hathaway, runs that organization. But Warren Buffett's only job is, what do I do with this marginal dollar? How do I invest it? And I think that there's something quite compelling around that. And as you know, Warren Buffett has been leading the charge to try and get rid of these quarterly earnings. We've actually seen now it's becoming much more politicized. Elizabeth Warren in the United States, as well as President Trump, have talked about how we might think about moving away from quarterly reporting.
I want to bring forward a point of yours that might seem provoking to some people. You have suggested weighted voting, meaning it's no longer one man, one vote, but that our ballots should count for more or less, depending on what criteria, education or
so it's absolutely not about education. I like to say I'm a black woman from Africa. I'd be the first person struck off the list if we started using some of these metrics. So obviously I'm not going to be a turkey voting for Christmas. What I am suggesting is that I believe we should reward people for participating in the political process. One of the problems that, as people I'm sure are aware with the Brexit agenda right now, is that there is a sense that there's no legitimacy around these decisions. And it's very similar to what's happening in the United States with President Trump. At the very core values, people are trying to find reasons to say, well, the voter didn't really understand what was going on. I think that there are many ways. As an immigrant myself from Africa, I'm required to take tests if I want to get a green card or some form of residency. I don't see why we should not encourage some kind of civic duty, some civic responsibility of citizens by them being required to take some kind of testing. How that test might be administered and what questions is something that is up for debate, but I think it's really important that people do take that responsibility very seriously. Having 30% participation rates, I think, is just wholly unacceptable, and I think it's very emblematic of the challenges that democracy is facing today.
But those rates don't apply to all parts of the world. In Denmark, for the last time there was an election, I think it was past 87%.
Yes, but that is incredibly rare. If you look at the majority of, and I've looked at the Danish numbers, if you look at many of the European countries, the average is around 50%, and sometimes high 50s. The United States is about 50%, 30% for low-income households, which tends to skew to minority groups and women.
Just to correct myself, it was 85.8 at the last general election, but before that it was 87.7, so that's very high. Mm-hmm. Let's tap into some other questions here, because someone asks, do you believe, which this is something that is being discussed in Denmark at political levels, do you believe a worldwide base income will solve part of the structural risks or changes?
So I think I have a lot more faith in humanity. I think that we can put a man on the moon, we can cure polio. I think we can actually, or smallpox certainly, I think we can actually do better than just handing out cash. I wrote a whole book on the failures of the aid system to my own continent of Africa. We've spent over $1 trillion of money that has gone to that continent, and in fact, it's much worse off. In fact, it's peeling off from the rest of the world in many, many metrics. But if you want to take a more specific example in the United States, look at the universal basic income agenda for Native Americans. If you look at the original American population, the Indian Americans, there are numerous papers that have written about suicide rates, drug addiction, because every month they receive a check. I think that there's something deeply important for human beings, and Steve Hawking talked about this, for us to derive value from work and participating in community. And I think there's something very demeaning and condescending have people just simply be cut a check and expected to solve their problems. So I'm an eternal optimist. I have not seen an aid program work long term. The programs that have worked in countries like Korea or in Botswana, there are 20 of them, what they call aid graduates, have been interventions that have been short, sharp, and immediate and confined. Marshall Plan is another great example, but not open-ended commitments, which I think really create a lot of corrosive behavior by governments.
But you say that you're an optimist and that you have faith in humanity.
Yes.
So there are some trends rising in terms of circular economy, recycling, upscaling, downsizing, minimizing consumption levels. This is all on a micro level. Does that have any effect?
So I think it's too soon to say no, it has no effect. I'm all about innovation, and this is one of the things that, going back to your last question, infuriates me. Most businesses will have a shorter period of time to test innovations and new ideas. If it doesn't work, they move on. Something like the aid programs have been going on for 60 years, and even though there are no substantial results that actually have shown longevity, people continue to keep doing the same thing. I think it was Einstein that said that's the definition of madness, expecting a different result but doing the same thing. And so I think that when I think about upscaling and some of these innovations, there's a fantastic book that came out last year by a woman. The book is called Janesville. It's about company interventions in a small town in the United States, trying to get them to retool. And the net answer is that it doesn't really work, because who wants to, at 50, retool and reskill? It's a very, very difficult thing to try and encourage. And so I think we should be optimistic that there are new ideas and fresh ideas. And there are many ideas that public policy grapples with all the time. And technology is also helping for us to think of new ways to do old things in a more efficient way. But I do think, I think one of the inherent things is we have to be able to cut the cord when something is not working on a public policy basis.
Well, for sure, you have really opened up some serious challenges that we should all bear in mind. I think we perhaps need another 10 minutes to cover them all and fix everything. Unfortunately, we don't have time to fix the world today, so this is all the time we had. Thank you so much for bringing all these pressing matters to us.
Thanks very much.